Contemporary reading, Sarah Laughed, by M. Suzanne Terry. I will make you a great nation. Sarah, you will bear a son. The visitor always did like to make an entrance. None of the standards. No, how have you been? Or, friend, that was a long journey. Only a big announcement would do. She heard while she was minding the supper dishes, and Sarah laughed. The visitor was perplexed. Why is Sarah laughing? What? Does she think I can't? Abraham, sweet man, tried to act as if it was nothing, to deflect the sound coming from the other room. Probably just thinking about something funny that has happened today. She stood in the kitchen, listening to the men make plans, and Sarah laughed. Wouldn't this have made more sense, Sarah wondered, to have told me this himself? Abraham's a good husband, but there is only so much that even a good husband can do to bring about a child. I guess I should be flattered, she thought. They're throwing me a surprise party in my womb. And Sarah laughed. She remembered those elusive promises and hopes that had stirred. How long had the story been told? Around tables and fires, shrouded in wonder and awe, descendants outnumbering the sand. It need only start with one. But that one was nowhere to be found. She had been told of his perfect timing, so Sarah laughed. She remembered the elusive sleep and garments rent. How many tears she had shed, surrounded by a sea of children, but always on the other side of the door. Skin knee unbandaged, wedding unattended, grandchildren unheld. Age showing her what she was capable of as the bleeding stopped and the book closed. She'd already cried, so Sarah laughed. Is this how promises are fulfilled? To wait until all hope, desire, and ability are gone, to finally bring her what she'd always wanted, but only after it was too late for her to enjoy it fully. Just to make himself look special, more special than everybody already knew he was. Maybe what she wanted to do was punch him, but she couldn't, so Sarah laughed. For testing encounters with mystery, thanks be to God.
May I speak and may we all reflect in the power of that creating, inspiring, sustaining love with whom we cry our deepest sorrows, with whom we laugh again, and with whom we find fresh joy. Amen. Maybe what she wanted to do was punch him, God. But she couldn't, so Sarah laughed. Didn't Suzanne Terry put it well in that poem, Sarah Laughed? How many of us have wanted to punch God, or worse, for what has happened or not happened to ourselves or to others? In Genesis chapter 18, Sarah laughs, as Lionel says, a very ambiguous laughter with various levels in it, but it comes from these deep sorrows of experiences of sorrow, of anger, and utter frustration with God. After all, she has experienced as the text partly says to us in that poem, as a childless migrant woman in an ancient patriarchal culture where childbearing was so important, after all that she has experienced with that and on the journey, how dare God now turn up and declare fresh hope? Why does it take so long? Why, O God? Why put Sarah through such trials and other people through such trials? We can easily identify with that, can't we? Not just if you're a childless woman who has longed for a child for so long, but for so many other types of people, not least those who struggle as refugees. As elsewhere in the Bible, we're not presented with a simple moral or spiritual inspiration. Rather, we're invited into this very human struggle with which we're invited to wrestle and with our own sufferings. Suzanne Terry's poem is a response to this and to a book called Those Who Wait, Finding God in Disappointment, Doubt, and Delay. This, like other writings by Tanya Marlowe, seeks to explore those things and how we live with the realities of suffering. Before reflecting specifically on Sarah's laughter and Tanya Marlowe's insights, it is perhaps helpful, though, to remind ourselves of the nature of the Abraham and Sarah narratives, part of which we heard last week, and we'll hear another section next week. Because like other stories of the patriarchs in the Bible, they're neither straightforward records of our faith lineage, still less history as such. And that's the clear conclusion of our search for the historical Abraham and Sarah, which exercised many archaeologists, biblical scholars and others throughout the 20th century. So there's now, I think, a wide consensus that Abraham and Sarah were not historical figures, or at least as presented in the Bible. Instead, like the Exodus and Judges narratives in the Bible, these stories are principally written up later as constructs of the 6th century before Christ. Now, that does not mean that we're not people called Sarah and Abraham in the stories, in the faith's formative past, only that we cannot recover their realities. So we shouldn't read those stories as if they were a story, I was going to say out of our newspapers, but we can't really always rely on those either. These stories are part of the reforming of the people of Israel after the great upheavals of the Babylonian exilic era. Tremendous suffering and upheavals. So like all nations, they therefore draw together history with myth and legend in creative acts of storytelling, seeking to affirm key values rather than being worried particularly about literal facts, although some may be there in the story. And to a degree, I think sometimes we see this in Australia in some of the stories we tell about ourselves as a people, not least around the Anzac myth, which has history but has a lot of other things within it. So were Abraham and Sarah actual refugees, precariously seeking new life in a new land? As some have suggested, peoples would have moved around the Middle East, especially when there was periods of famine, when there was ecological change and such like, as we're experiencing today. Well, maybe they were, but probably not. The people of Israel were probably most likely formed from various pre-existing Canaanite and other cultures rather than by a lot of outsiders pouring in. But it doesn't invalidate the stories, whatever you make of the Abraham narratives. Because the point of these stories, and they're linked with the rest of the stories in the Bible, is that they affirm the heart of Israel's faith down the centuries, which Christians have taken on in their own form in focusing on Jesus. These vital truths that are vital to hear as we mark Refugee Week this week. that God is typically found among the strangers and the outcasts, including the disappointed women, like Sarah. That God companions those people who wish to walk with God, maybe in an uncertain but a sure assurance of faith through a pilgrim journey on the way. And that God is calling, inspiring, and sustaining them and all who would travel with God and God's people into new life. That's the heart of the gospel, I think, for this Refugee Sunday. Like other biblical stories, the Abraham and Sarah narratives are also not intended to convey simple moral or religious teaching. What Lionel said is fair, that is that to look at the language more deeply, don't read simply off the story, but let it, tease it, test it, talk to it, and out of it, new life emerges. In other words, we take these texts seriously, but not literally, as people like to say here in Pitt Street. And that's actually how the ancients also understood the primary value of these stories. And we see that in the New Testament, where St. Paul, for example, describes next week's story of Sarah and Hagar, Ishmael and Isaac, as an allegory. So like many Christian theologians have done down the centuries, we can therefore, similarly, for example, read this text through a Christian lens and see God as Holy Trinity in those three persons. Abraham and Sarah as a new Adam and Eve, and or a prefiguring of Mary and Joseph, similarly gifted a child in surprising circumstances. And like Moses and Jesus, they also come out of a land of oppression into freedom, and with the bitter laughter of disappointment and death mixed in with the promise and the ultimate gift of the laughter of resurrection through God's grace. Because such texts are an invitation to us into spiritual exploration, to bring ourselves to the stories and our world to the stories in relationship with God, rather than literal or straightforward declarations of a path ahead. So what might today's story say to us today? Let us return to the reflections of Tanya Marlowe I mentioned earlier, which are intimately entwined with her personal story. Because she's a former Christian ministry teacher and also a Church of England vicar's wife, who from her late teens has suffered from ME, known as chronic fatigue syndrome here in Australia. It's been horrendous for her in that journey. The most devastating outbreak of her chronic illness came with her baby's birth, after which she found she couldn't even stand up or even hold her child. So when she was breastfeeding, people had to bring the child to her for 30 minutes at most and assist her with that process. She learned, and is learning, she says, the awful reality of suffering, and in it often the silence of God. She could truly therefore identify with Sarah and with others in the Bible like Job, who struggle with seemingly meaningless suffering and the difficulties of faith when you don't get the response you feel you ought to get from God. And so Tanya has an understanding, I think, of the part of Sarah's bitterness in the laughter she has in our story today. Because Tanya herself has argued and argued with God about her own and others' pain and experienced deep frustration in waiting on God in prayer. As I say, this story, Tanya's story, is our story, isn't it? And so many others, people of faith who struggle with suffering as well as the faith of God we wish to affirm and the grace of God within it. But, as Tanya herself puts it, she's also a living paradox that healing beyond ordinary human hope does in fact happen. When she was only 6 days old, she suffered a brain hemorrhage and was rushed by her non-church-going parents, non-faith-believing people, to Great Ormond Street, the famous leading children's hospital in London. And there the expert doctors all agreed that Tanya would either die, most likely, or if she did, she would never be able to read or write, and her capacity for what we call usual life was very, very limited. All they could suggest was prayer. And prayer worked, because healing prayer can indeed sometimes surprise us extraordinarily in that way, even radically physically as well as spiritually. But Tanya herself, even though she's happy for people to participate in that, and it's part of our Christian community, does not seek that kind of prayer for herself, but rather seeks, as she puts it, to live through acceptance rather than hope, because to over-hope, as it were, is to lead to more and more hurt. So in this, whether or not healing prayer works for us or others, she invites us, as she puts it, to find gold amid the thorns of life, as it were, to discover the cry of Isaac, even in our language of lament. If we avoid, therefore, the trap of seeking historical proofs for faith in the Bible and a simple story of faith going way back 2,000 years, or the traps of either seeking false piety, false hope, or beating ourselves up for our limitations because we can't match up to the standards that we think God is asking of us, we too can similarly use stories like Sarah and Abraham to find gold even in the midst of trial. Our lives, aren't they, like those of Sarah and Abraham, are full of thorns, which is a biblical metaphor for suffering St. Paul and others use. But we have a choice. This is the key thing. We cannot avoid suffering. The Buddha's quite clear, and all the great teachers. We cannot avoid suffering. That's there, and it's hard to explain. But it's how we use it. How do we approach suffering makes all the difference. That's the heart of authentic faith. For as Dorothy L. Sayers put it, Christianity does not give us a supernatural explanation for suffering, that is, a more than natural explanation. Those who seek to give us one usually do indeed leave us wanting to punch God or worse. But Christianity, Dorothy L. Sayers said, does give us a supernatural use for suffering. Not an explanation, but a use. Because as Job puts it, who suffered horribly in our stories in the Bible, in God's grace and presence, after I have been tested, or as I am tested, I will come forth as gold. There is gold even in Sarah's laughter. One of the haunting lines in Genesis chapter 18 is this question: is anything too wonderful for God? The temptation of piety is simply to answer, no, of course, God can do anything. But the heart of biblical faith is surely to live with that question. Is anything too wonderful for God? Because like Sarah and Tanya Marlowe and so many people struggling with all kinds of suffering, God often does not appear to want to answer in a hurry. Authentic faith in that sense, our faith, is not about seeking easy answers, especially when it comes to suffering, and especially the suffering of others, but to live with the mystery in which, as our text puts it, in due season, there may come realization of long-postponed hope, or maybe something else, because among the thorns we will find gold. Now, we can easily give up on faith, as many do, disillusioned and angry with God. That's understandable. And we need to express our anger. As a Catholic friend said to Penny and I the other day, Reflect and Connect, sometimes WTF is the truest prayer. But, says Tanya, two things might encourage us to persist in faith. This is what she's found as someone struggling with this profound chronic illness, to find gold among the thorns. The first is that with Sarah, with Ruth, with Job, and with those who've gone before us in the stories of faith, the Bible and our Christian faith is full of stories similar to our own, from which to which we can identify and through which we can find strength, because they triumphed and they did find gold even amidst the thorns. That's the first thing. Secondly, as I say, when we walk through suffering, and all of us have to do that, and some of us have worse than others, we have a choice. Do we want to struggle with it just on our own, just with our anger and frustration, or do we choose to struggle with it with God and to shout and to scream and all the rest that is quite legitimate to do, but also to listen, to find the gold and the grace that may be there within it that can transform even the hardest things in our lives? Do we want to share our suffering with God and with others too who are on that path, or will we try and do it all on our own? Another hard one, suffering offering from Tanya Marlowe, thus relates to the picture on the front of our pew sheet this morning. You may have wondered why it's there. Lady in Red by the British abstract painter Martin Bush. When people visit Tanya, they encounter two paintings in her living room. The first is a fluid, fun picture of the local town. And visitors look at it and say, "Oh, how nice it is." And then they look at that other one and it puzzles them, as it might have puzzled you when you first saw it. And after a while, they ask about it. And when they're told it is called Lady in Red, they go, "Oh," because it helps us a bit, doesn't it? But then gradually they make more sense of the passionate swirls and energy around the Lady in Red at the centre. They stare harder, and some still do not like it. But most, when they stop longer, find it a more rewarding, if more demanding, picture than the instantly accessible language. And that, I think, is the kind of, as it were, the kind of art, the kind of spirituality, the kind of faith, the kind of truth and strength that the Bible and Christian faith offers. If we want simple answers, a simple daub, as it were, a clear poster, then, or straightforward answer to our lives, then go elsewhere. But if we take these stories and the whole of our faith, with our suffering and our joy and our experience, with one another, and look more deeply and wait upon God and allow the mystery in those things and in the Bible and Christian faith to look at us, then we can find more gold among the thorns, more rewarding, though it is more demanding. So this brings us back in conclusion to Sarah and her laughter, because Sarah laughs famously twice in Genesis. This first time, it is an ambiguous laughter, but it is full of bitterness, I think, out of suffering and anger with God and her husband, as we heard in the poem. But when her child is born, Isaac, she laughs again, and this time with joy, gold amid the thorns. And I think this transition may be helped by the dialogue with God in the story. Because as the text says, why did she deny she'd laughed? Because she is afraid. Fear. That's what keeps us from love and the potential of life. She was afraid. Maybe Sarah was clinging, this is my take, even in her bitter laughter, to an understanding of God as power over her, a power with the freedom to prolong or end her suffering, and therefore God is, as it were, like a joker playing with her life and with this awful suffering. But only when she lets go of her fear of this power over her and understands that God truly, despite what other people's gods are like, is not a God over us, the God of the Christian faith, most truly understood, but a power not over us, but with us, and a power in us. Then she discovers the capacity for new life. Such a God is not a force from which you need to hide. If God is with you and in you, you don't need to hide from a power that might put you down if you've stepped out of line. but truly a true companion who might not be able to fix your issues, just as some of our best friends and those who really sustain us in life don't fix things, but in walking with us, they enable new ways to offer up or things that are hard to fall away. And a God who journeys with us, bearing both our best and our worst, enabling the discovery of gold and thorns. So such a companioning God, a God with us and in us, with the refugees and in the refugees, can bear our rages, our frustrations, even our bitter laughter, because God is there in our sufferings and seeks with us the laughter of heaven. Even healing for us, or surprising changes that will transform our lives. In the name of Christ, who suffers with us and invites us into resurrection laughter. Amen.